Here I am.
Great.
Welcome, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes.
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 So welcome, everyone, to the second lecture of the Chris Freeman Centenary lecture series. Today, we will talk on the economics of technological change in selected heterodox schools of thought. The session will be chaired and discussed by Professor Giovanni Dosi. We have two speakers, Dr. João Marcos Hausmann Tavares and Dr. Verónica Robert. A short note about the series. This series is in honor of Christopher Freeman, the founding father of modern innovation studies. 2021 is his birth centenary year. He was born on 11 September 1921. This talk series is organized by a few alumni of PhD academies of the Global Network for the Economics of Learning, Innovation, and Competence Building Systems, GlobalX, founded by Bente Lundwall. So the whole talk series involves 13 lecturers, 38 speakers, and it spans up to 3 months, up to the 1st of April. Mostly the talks are by early career researchers in the fields of economics of innovation, and they will be discussed by senior scholars. The main objectives of this talk series are to attract young blood into the discipline, to create a space for interaction between young and senior scholars, and to spread the discipline to new geographical areas. Talking about geographical areas, as of yesterday, we had 265 people registered, out of which 16% are from Asia, 21% from Europe, 32% from Latin America, 11% from Turkey, 19% from Africa, and 1% from North America. If we look at the occupational spread, we see that around 33% are students, 30% are researchers, 21% are professors, 10% are master students, and 6% belong to other categories. This is the second session of the talk series. Here you will see the upcoming talks. This is a short glimpse. Please do visit our website for more information on this. Now we move to the lectures of today. Obviously, to this crowd, I don't have to introduce Professor Giovanni Dosi. He's a professor at the Institute of Economics at Scuola Superiore Sant'Anna. He's also the co-director of the Industrial Policy and Intellectual Property Rights Task Forces at the Initiative for Policy Dialogue at Columbia University. He acts as the Continental Europe editor of the journal Industrial and Corporate Change. He is in the ISI highly cited research list consistently for quite some time, and also as of today, he has been ranked first in the list of top Italian scientists in the field of business sciences. In 2016, he became the first European to receive the very distinguished, really Team Distinguished Scholar Award by the Technology and Innovation Management Division of the American Academy of Management, which is also known as the Nobel Prize of Management. I take this opportunity to thank Professor Giovanni Dosi for his very valuable and unique contribution to the fields of economics of innovation. Thank you also for accepting the invitation to take part in this talk series. The two early career speakers we have are Dr. João Marcos Hausmann Tavares, who is a professor at Fluminense Federal University at Rio de Janeiro, and Dr. Verónica from the Institute of Advanced Studies in Social Sciences at Universidade Nacional de San Martín. This is a mandatory announcement that the entire meeting is being recorded for academic purpose. The Zoom platform is provided by the United Nations University, Maastricht Economic and Social Research Institute on Innovation and Technology. We are also live on YouTube. A short note, we will take the questions towards the end. I request you to send your questions as a private chat to me, so it does not go unnoticed in the group chat. Now I hand it over to Professor Giovanni Dosi.
Well, hello. You have been very, very praising, Nanditha. Thanks for the presentation. What I will do as an introduction of the discussion that will follow is to place the question that will be addressed in a sort of grand way in terms of the big questions that were raised since the inception of political economy, since the time of Smith, before Smith-Petty, all the way to Marx. Now, there were basically three questions. One is, what makes the system moving? That is, what are the drivers and pattern of change of the capitalist machine of production and innovation? Remember that to place it in context, in the entire human history, you had essentially flat per capita income when we were hunter-gatherers. Then there was a little blip up when we became, we introduced agriculture, but we were flat there. That did not mean, of course, that you did not have some technical progress, some advancement, for example, in agriculture. But you had a Malthusian mechanism so that population was growing accordingly and per capita income were essentially stationary. For the first time in human history, with the Industrial Revolution, you have got exponential growth, not only in income, but also in per capita income. So the growth of the product is much higher than the growth in the population. Now, that was, for the contemporary observer, was a big deal. And in fact, it was a big deal. And the question is, what drives it? The second question is, what are the mechanisms of coordination among a multitude of decentralized agents? The third question related to the first two is why some countries succeed in doing this, in taking off, in undertaking the Industrial Revolution, and most others do not. Now, all three questions are, of course, very, very up to date too. I mean, and also the order to which you answer to these questions matters in terms of the interpretation of the historical evidence. If you go back to Adam Smith, The Wealth of Nations, he begins with the story of increasing returns. It begins with the story of change. There is division of labor. The first chapter, there is division of labor. Division of labor implies higher productivity. Higher productivity means lower prices, which mean bigger market, which means further dynamic increasing returns. It's essentially a story of dynamic increasing returns. And he writes, as the key driving force, he writes, Adam Smith, is the invention of a great number of machines which facilitate and abridge labor and enable one man to do the work of many. There is already there the role of technical change and innovation as the fundamental driver, not the only one, but the fundamental driver of change. The issue of coordination comes much later. I mean, the infamous statement on the invisible hand that ignorant people that have never read The Wealth of Nations keep citing is only mentioned once in book 4. And in a sense, in more than a sense, I mean, the coordination properties come from the fact that the system is changing. Is what Marika Virgilito and I, in the paper on structural change and economic dynamics, 2017, jokingly called the bicycle theorem. Well, you stand up on a bicycle much easier if you cycle. It's very difficult to stand up. There are champions that stand up even without cycling, but it's much more difficult. And it's a highly unstable equilibrium. While if you keep cycling, this makes you relative stability, despite the fact that the trajectories when you cycle can be described by a system of unstable differential equation, but still you stand up. Out of the metaphor, coordination is driven by the fact that prices tend to adjust to an ever-changing cost of production, that demand evolve in relatively ordered matter, in via-Engels curves, etc. So order, as Metcalfe puts it, rather than equilibrium, is generally the norm. I say generally because you have crisis, you've got fluctuation, you've got crisis, sometimes also deep crisis. This link between change and coordination and this intertwining is there, of course, in Marx, that was celebrating the revolutionizing property of capitalism, is there in Keynes. The fact that investment is essentially driven by aggregate demand and autonomous investment that we could reinterpret in terms of new opportunity of innovation, of new method of production, etc. And coordination is there, but is imperfectly there. And in fact, the witness is the persistent presence of unemployment, even in developed countries. I think in the lecture it will come out more in detail Schumpeter is ambiguous. Schumpeter is ambiguous because he emphasizes innovation, but at the same time he's in love with Varras. And so thinks that innovation comes as a shock, but then as a disequilibrating shock, but then you have the system moving back to a Varesian equilibrium. And in fact, I mean, his best student, PhD student, was Paul Samuelson, that formalizes with the correspondence principle. He says, well, I have my master Schumpeter that is so good in telling me the story of innovation. Very well, this is the story of the shock that I leave to him that does not know mathematics. I will tell you the dynamics in terms of comparative statics. I take the fundamentals at t time t equals 0. I take the new fundamentals after the shock, and I compare the two, and this is dynamics as a series of comparative static exercises. As you know, the mainstream does exactly the opposite. Start from coordination and try to arrive to change without ever getting there. I mean, the research program, the Arrow-Debreu research program is to say, well, I prove the existence of a coordinating equilibrium, and then I put on the top of it, but first of all, I look for stability, which you don't find. Second, I try to add possibly dynamics. I mean, it was clear, Canaro was clear, the project was a failure. Because there is essentially a fundamental inconsistency between general equilibrium and the very notion of innovation. And you can find it more on this Arrow 1996, if I remember well, Industrial and Corporate Change, which I believe is the only time. I've asked him repeatedly to write it, and at the end he wrote it. And I published it on Industrial and Corporate Change. And basically he says, well, you don't, you can, if you have innovation, you lose all the theorems from general equilibrium, because innovation is an extreme form of increasing return. And if you've got increasing returns, you lose convexity. And if you lose convexity, you lose all the standard property of equilibrium, and perhaps even the very existence of equilibrium. Evolutionary theory picks up I think, in my view, the classical research program, and says, well, let's open up the black box, as Rosenberg used to say. And in this, you already said it, Nanditha, Chris Freeman was a provide fundamental seminal work. In fact, what is often forgotten is that the economics of innovation for Chris and for me and for Dick Nelson and for many, I was saying for Rosenberg, yes and no, because Rosenberg essentially was afraid to criticize Arrow. And Arrow was not afraid of critique. In fact, since no one criticized him, he criticized himself. But the others were too afraid. Well, I told this to Ken, and he enjoyed it very much. The last conference before he passed away that I organized in Berkeley, and essentially I told him that, and he said he enjoyed it. This idea that the economics of innovation is at the heart of evolutionary theory, I think, is often forgotten. Nowadays, it's always forgotten. It's forgotten even in the place that I see in your background, Nanditha, in merit. It's forgotten partly, at least partly, in Sprue. While I think this is core. Evolution, the study of innovation is the core element of an evolutionary theory of economic change. Having said that, I leave the floor to the proper lecture, and I will make some comment at the end.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Dosi. I will share my screen now. Okay, everybody is listening to me. Can you listen to me?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. So, welcome to the second lecture of this lecture series on innovation system. We are very happy to be here. Thank you very much for participating to this event and following by YouTube live stream. Thanks to Rajesh that organized this lecture series in honor to please Freeman, and for being behind every minimal detail regarding the realization of these events. But especially thanks for realizing that students all over the world would receive this with great enthusiasm. Also, we want to thank to Nanditha for her presentation, and to Professor Dosi that accepted to chair this session and comment after our presentation. So let's go to our topic now. Our lecture is titled The Economic of Technological Change and Selected Heterodox School of Economic Thought. It will be presented by both of us. And we are both from Latin America, as you can see. João is from Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, and I am from Buenos Aires, Argentina. And this is important since both cities have strong tradition in heterodox economics, and we expected here to link some of this tradition with the contemporary evolutionary theory, or broadly speaking, with innovation system literature or innovation studies. So, ahí está. The starting point here is to understand the importance of history in addressing innovation, technical change, and economic change. In the opening session of this lecture series, Professor Lumbal and Professor Alan Freeman highlighted the importance of deeper research in reasoned history regarding the recent publication of Freeman papers on history, co-evolution, and economic growth in industrial corporate change in 2019. Other authors like Nelson, Dosi, Perez, Malerba, among others, have recognized the relevance of deriving from history, where models and data are in continuous dialogue with each other. For instance, Nelson refers repeatedly to the need of appreciative theory, in which verbal descriptions and narratives spliced by numbers and struck in a reasoned but not formal way is preferred to raw quantitative information or deductive models, which assumptions are far away from reality. Malerba, together with other authors, have also thought the dialogue between formalization and history in their history-friendly models, where simulation seeks to account for economic history. For example, the stories raised by Malerba on industrial dynamics, or the stories raised by Sabiotti and Pica on the generation and regeneration of variety from rising the disposable income along the economic history. The idea of reasoning history raised a central methodological criterion among evolutionary authors. The methodological criterion unifies evolutionary tradition at the same time differentiated from others. Reasoning history is a midway between the two. By one hand, ad hoc adoctrination grounding on assumptions about firms' behavior, information, and competition, most of the time unrealistic as proposed by a standard neoclassical model, or collecting data and empirical evidence and put into display like an antique shop without or with low systematization. This kind of heavily empirical analysis might end up having little or no capacity for explaining economical phenomena. In this sense, the revaluation of history, of a reasoned history, became crucial to methodological criterion of the evolutionary approach. And it helped us to understand the past, the present, and to build the future also. The idea of reasoned history is what we propose to apply here in today's presentation in order to build a very brief reasoned history of economic ideas around, in fact, the issue of technological change and its relationship with economic change. Economic change, therefore, will play the main role articulating our timeline, and it will allow us to make sense to our history. It's important to say that we are talking on change or transformation in opposition to coordination of order, both, as Professor Dosi has said, major issues in economic theory. We will see that the question of change and transformation has been a key concern in classical political economy, and it was later abandoned by neoclassical economists since they were focused on the problem of allocation resources addressed through the price theory and general equilibrium model. However, throughout the 20th century, there were authors and traditions that continue to be concerned with change, traditions that we understand lead us to the contemporary evolutionary theory and the evolutionary system approach. In other words, contemporary evolutionary theory is grounded in a broad evolutionary tradition in economics that has put technological change, but also organizational change, interactions, rules, norms, and institutions in the center of the scene to explain technological change and economic growth. But not all these dialogues and breaches are always clear, and in this presentation, we will stress the necessity of clarifying those dialogues. In this lecture, we will analyze the role played by economics of technological change, evolutionary theory, and innovation system approach within a broader framework of economic history, of history of economic thought. And by doing this, we expect that the student will be able to understand the potentialities and the scope of the innovation literature, as well as their boundaries and limits. So the objectives of this lecture is twofold. First is to investigate the role played by innovation studies with major trends in the history of economic thought. And second, to provide to young students the tools to consistently articulate innovation system literature with other branches of economic thought concerned with economic change. We will take into account effective demand as an autonomous driver of economic change, and structuralism that analyze not only the relationship between a structural condition and development, but also underdevelopment and the blockades that periphery economies could face in their interface path to a structural change. We have prepared this presentation taking into consideration a target audience of grade and master students, especially from Global South. Nevertheless, we are very happy to see here several colleagues' faces, and I hope all together we'll enrich the debate at the end of our presentation. So this is the layout of our presentation. As you can see, it will focus on the dialogue with effective demand and structuralism. Now I pass the floor to João to continue.
So thank you, Verónica, for introducing the lecture. So doing a comprehensive reason and a critical analysis of the history of economic thought is a decisive step to enhance our analytical skills about different economic systems and the way they change over time. The framework that many heterodox economists use to do is often supported by a selection of different heterodox schools of economic thought. So if you want to develop a similar strategy, it is necessary to try to understand more about these different schools and how do they relate with each other. Combining different schools of economic thought is a theoretical strategy also often criticized by different scholars, sometimes with good critics and sometimes with bad critics. However, in a way or another, it's a widely diffused strategy used by many renowned economists from nowadays and throughout the history. So each economist uses different combinations of schools of economic thought. For example, Mariana Mazzucato tries to combine some national system of innovation perspective with Minskian and Keynesian style arguments and developmental inputs. Our today's discussant, Giovanni Dosi, published in 2017 a text defending Schumpeter meeting Keynes models, a return to the classical economists, and also even highlighted the usefulness of the French École de Régulation to do historical analysis. François Chenet combined Marxist theories with Schumpeterian, neo-Schumpeterian, and Keynesian research. José Castellato and Helena Lastra, as representatives of the Latin American tradition, combined the literature of national systems of innovation with Latin American structuralism, as well as Mathew Timothy does. So this list could go on and on. So a first advice on the matter is that it's important to note this diversity. In spite of some overlapping choices, different economists do select different schools of economic thought to build their analytical framework. The diversity is even greater when we talk about methodology. Some of them use formal models, some of them use simulation methods, some of them do not use formal models, some of them use historical methods. There's no single way of doing it, and there are potentialities, problems, and challenges in all methodological or theoretical choice that one decides to make. However, and especially to younger students, it may be really hard to judge, to select, and even to combine theories that will effectively help us to do our analytical task. I try to show you some key debates in the history of economic thought that I expect you to develop a similar strategy. I won't give you an how-to guide or a manual of how to deal with all challenges involved in the matter. But I do like to drive your attention to some very basic and important issues related to the relationship between the different schools of economic thought. For example, what's that they're talking about? Or in other words, what are the themes and the objects that they're discussing or focusing? So in spite of the fact that different schools of economic thought do sometimes share the same objects, they are often also different. So sometimes for one reason or another, this difference is not even easy even to notice. Sometimes the difference is just the primary focus and it gets lost in a complex analysis that derives from it. But it's important to develop our attention to the thematic boundaries among the different schools of economic thought. Though not sufficient, because it is not simple to combine different theories, and there are interesting methodological and theoretical discussions on the matter. This attention may be a very important step to try to extract the best of the different schools of economic thought. You will need it if you want to analyze the broad complexity of the historical process of the economic systems. Questions regarding relevance and even theoretical consistency will also be highlighted in this lecture in appropriate moments. So in this slide, I try to show you an overview of key debates and controversies that shaped the different schools of economic thought. It is, of course, a selection based on the schools of different perspectives that surrounded the trajectories of two Latin American scholars, Verónica and me. But it's also a selection guided by the desire to give better explanations and answers to the societal challenge that haunt our societies, especially the ones from the global south. So let us see what our academic field have to say on the matter. So the School of Economic Thought are somewhat alike scientific paradigms. And once we became aware of the problems they are trying to solve at the moment they arose, we may be more aware of their specificities, their potentialities, and their boundaries. So let's first take a brief look on the emergency of neo-Schumpeterian paradigm during the 70s and 80s. We have Nelson Winter challenging neoclassical micro-foundations and proposing an evolutionary theory of economic change. We read Giovanni Dosi discussing technological paradigms and trajectories. We have Freeman leading the Savo project and identifying empirical regularities of innovation in firms. Lundwall was talking about interactive learning. François Chenet talked about systemic competitivity, among others. They all had a research agenda focusing on some key themes that were relatively close to each other. But since the neoclassical economics had some to say on the exact same themes, a theoretical choice had to be made. We could not combine theories with radically different explanations about the same thematic topic. So let's try to be synthetic here and look how different was some of these neo-Schumpeterian claims in regarding to some of the neoclassical claims in the very same topics. First, we may remember the relevance of Schumpeterian competition and its relation with structural change. Competition would not be understood primarily in terms of price competition in a single market, but more through quantitative and qualitative metrics whose progress depended on innovation on different markets and sectors. So innovation were now a decisive part of economic competition, and there was no reason to believe that it depended solely on exogenous elements from economic system. It was the opening of the black box of innovation. Technology was not on a shelf. So in spite of the fact that it was an important production, it could not be transacted as a commodity. As a capital, it had some unique characteristics. Among them, the accumulation does not depend solely on R&D investments, but also by the whole set of institutional interactions and learning systems. It's not fully embedded in machinery and equipment, but also in the whole formal and informal interactions, arrangements of national and regional systems of innovation. Through the notions of technological trajectories and paradigms, the very nature of innovation itself would be better understood as a process and not as single goods, services, or machinery. Finally, the very Schumpeterian claim, or neo-Schumpeterian claim here, that the most relevant for discussions among economists was to understand how do economic structures change was remarkably different than the seek for the general equilibrium within neoclassical economics. These all and other issues became part of the whole micro-foundations basis of the modern evolutionary and innovation system paradigms. So if you're talking about structural change and the role that technological change has in the matter, it's important to be consistent with these new concepts. Innovation policies are a central part of structural change, and in order to be effective, they should take these considerations, these new fundamentals in account. But of course, there's these new authors who not focus on everything that matters to better understand the economic system. And of course, this is not a problem because economics on my connection is right now stable. You still hear me? It's okay? Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks. It's not a problem because it's important to recognize that we'll never know everything on economics or any other matter. However, since we do want to provide clear and better explanations to and answers to our broad and practical challenges in society, unemployment, inequality, environmental destruction, health crisis, etc., we do need to keep it on enhancing our analytical framework. And for the good or the bad, there was other moments in the history of economic thought that other themes were the center of the discussions that ended up shaping the different schools of economic thought. Knowing and thinking more about these controversies may help you identify the nature, the potentialities, and the boundaries of the different schools of economic thought. Let's now take, for example, the second half of the 19th century, when the debate on value and distribution proposed by the marginalist revolution gave birth to the neoclassical as we know it. Before that, and making a long story short, besides discussing technical change, the classical economists such as David Ricardo, Adam Smith, and Marx argued that distribution of value could be understood as determined by the bargaining power between different and conflicting economic classes. The neoclassical economists challenged this fundamental of these theories and proposed an alternative explanation. Distribution would be understood not as determined by bargaining power of different classes, but by the market forces that would reward different factors of production according to their marginal productivity. In my personal view, the marginalist revolution was a step back in our understanding of economics. Nevertheless, this moment of the history of economic thought made a clear division between two competing paradigms that still coexist in current economic schools of thought. The way you see this debate, or the way the research in economics that you were involved with relates to this old debate, will make a major impact on how do you see power relations, distribution of income and inequality today. Though marginalism is the mainstream vision, some of the most interesting heterodox schools do use this framework of classical economists on the matter. So let's put these two controversies in perspective. The paradigmatic shift they two made had at the core two different ends. One was about structural change, innovation, and consequence. Other had value and distribution at its core. The heterodox schools of economic thought that survived from these debates kept at the center of their research agenda different themes. And because of the thematic differences of the debates that shaped these schools, we might be able to combine schools with different focuses. I say we might be able to combine them because if you think a bit longer on the matter, there are indeed some unneglectable challenges of many dimensions to do it. Methodological challenge, theoretical challenges, practical challenges, etc. Nevertheless, the very possibility to bridge and to combine different perspectives is there to be researched and explored. So let's now move one step further on the issue of economic thought. A key debate that happened in the USA and Europe during the Great Depression was, well, about the Great Depression and the unemployment associated with it. Stay on the last slide. On the last slide.
Okay, I'm sorry.
Okay, no problem. Thanks for leading this. A key debate that happened in the USA and Europe during the Great Depression was about the Great Depression, right? So neoclassical economists reigned in the profession and argued that a free labor market would be sufficient to tackle unemployment. Given what economists at the time called the principle of substitution, the lowering of wages could make firms to choose to use more labor force and capital in their production methods. At that moment, Keynes wrote his famous book, The General Theory of Employment, Interest and Money. And while keeping much of the neoclassical framework, he argued that market forces would not be sufficient to restore employment. He says that we will need to develop a theory of production and that we will need to take into account the effective demand in it. The decision by firms to produce an employment would be bounded by their selling of goods and services. The sales law would not be valid and hence the aggregate demand could not be taken as granted and fiscal policies of governmental could be used to restore employment. Keynes' revolution was also a paradigmatic shift in the history of economic thought. Nowadays, the way your research deals with this debate, this old debate, will do also a major difference for the good or the bad in the way you see the fiscal policies, growth, and unemployment. The same stands if you end up neglecting this debate. If you try to talk nowadays about growth, fiscal policies, and unemployment, you'll be dwelling with the matters of this debate, and it is best if you are aware of it. So, is it the same thematic core of the debates we previously discussed? It is not. And because of this difference, we may indeed learn and see whether we can combine something from these debates and take the best of the different schools in the history of economic thought that derived from these debates. It might be the case that once you do that, some colleagues and scholars advise you not to do it. So not to combine different perspectives. Their justification will range from a wide set of good and bad reasons, because some of the reasons they will give you are valid to hear in debate, but some of them are not that much. So we'll talk later a bit more on one or two good reasons to be cautious with this strategy. But for now, I just hope you'll find your own way through these challenges. But finally, I would like to introduce to you one last key debate in the history of economic thought. It's a debate well known and carried by many Latin American scholars, but not that much listened in other continents. In 1949, an Argentinian economist called João, he published the first version of a very important report in the CLAC, Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean, that would be known as the economic development of Latin America and its principal problems. One may say that this report gave birth to the Latin American structuralism, and it was followed by some major contributions made by Celso Furtado and other economists. They confidently argued that due to structural difference between peripheral countries such as Latin American countries and central countries such as USA and Europe, the economic change and development would face challenges unforeseen by liberal economies of the time. The way peripheral economies are integrated within international political economy shared no symmetry of the central countries. Among the different issues that we could raise, it was highlighted that the tendency for peripheral countries to face particularly relevant problems in their balance of payments, both to commercial and finance accounts. This would become a major constraint for structural change, fiscal policies, growth, inflation, and many other economic issues. And the development, Furtado argued, should not be understood then as a backwardness, since it is not a step behind the steps already supposedly taken by developed countries. Alternatively, underdevelopment would be a specific way of economic evolution, change, given their specific historical backgrounds and their specific relationship with the world political and economic order. So, for the sake of our presentation, let's again compare a bit further the debates raised by Latin American structuralism and their other debates we previously discussed. Which among the other debates we previously mapped had the influence of the historical backgrounds in underdeveloped structures at the core of the research agenda? None. It was not the core. It wasn't the primary focus from the neoclassical economists, either from Keynes or Schumpeter, and not from Adam Smith. So, in some sense, it's actually the responsibility for economists in Latin America to do that. And I'm kind of, I can say, glad that some of them did assume this responsibility to talk about the specificities of the structural evolution of these countries. But there's a matter of relevance here that I want to drive your attention to. Whether a theme and a theory is relevant or not often depends of the social group. What I would say here is that different themes have different relevances for different social groups from different countries, for example. And this affirmative stands for the very the very umbrella of the different schools of economic thought. And again, because of the thematic differences among the schools of economic thought, there's a possibility to combine them, or at least to try to critically combine them. One thing that's interesting on the matter is that Latin American structuralism, from the beginning, combined different realms of economic thinking. For example, David Ricardo and Keynes were important references for Prebisch and Celso Furtado from the beginning. And later, other economists combined Latin American structuralism with Marx, with Kalecki, the whole literature of technological change. The combination of different theories was and proved to be fruitful in developing a strong framework of analysis. But it's worth noting that the core of the research agenda was the specificities of the economic system of Latin American underdeveloped countries. So the next slide, please. At the Verónica, thanks. At the end of the day, why do we want to combine different theories and study history of economic thought? It's also because we do want to do better understanding of the complex reality of the economic system and its change. How to do behave over time, how do they change, and different economic, political, and societal variables do have complex interaction, and it's good to seek for support in research that was previously done and focusing on the matter. If we do not want to make the same mistakes and again, going back to a caring attention to the history and the history of economic thought is a decisive step to do it. So, in spite of some valuable potential of combining different heterodox schools, I would like to invite you all to discuss one more among the challenges that we have when we try to combine these different schools of economic thought. In order to do it in a proper manner, we can't avoid some theoretical attention, some tuning. I know sometimes it may be hard to do it, but it's really convenient to our task. For example, let's take now a closer look on how to debate that sparked the Keynesian revolution took place. When Keynes stated that market forces would not be enough to tackle unemployment, he was also observing that the usual state of affairs in capitalism is that economic systems does not use full capacity of production that it has. In spite of certain quantity of machinery, equipment, and labor force available, full employment of all the resources is not a phenomenon of the reality of capitalism. He says that solely the decision to produce goods and services does not generate a monetary income of sufficient quantity to compose the aggregate demand, due to uncertainty that surrounds secondary spending decisions from families and enterprise. When you analyze the economic system as a whole, Keynes argued, you should observe the behavior of the components of aggregate demand, such as consumption, investments, governmental expenditures, export, and also the demand from goods and services in other regions. Some imports, right? And some of them does not even depend, some of these expenditures does not even depend on current production. And if aggregate demand is not sufficient to buy the goods and services the economic system is able to produce, firms might choose to constrain the decision to produce and hence also to constrain the employment of the labor force. Though with different assumptions, different economists ranging from Malthus to Marx and Kalecki offered some similar theories on the matter. So if Keynes or these other economists have a point here, and I personally think that they do, they have a point. So even though Keynes was discussing with neoclassical economists, we should not forget about the matter whenever we want to discuss growth and unemployment. And this should have implications even for the contributions of modern evolutionary and innovation systems regarding technological change. For example, among the implications, innovation, may have in the economic system, the productivity growth of new machinery is certainly among the variables that innovation may want to explain, or may have innovation literature may want to explain an innovation impact. So let's pay attention here, because in a specific sense, not all sense, but in a specific sense, it doesn't matter how big productivity is, because it doesn't matter how big the capacity of production of an economic system is. Firms will still need to choose whether to use this enhanced capacity of production or not. The problem of effective demand and aggregate demand is still there. If we are to discuss production growth and unemployment, we still can't neglect this issue. What I said so far on the matter also does not mean a lot of things. It does not mean that productivity doesn't matter for any reason. It certainly does, as an important parameter of economic system, which is relevant in discussing many variables, including prices, and including some other variables that do have some indirect influence on growth and employment. It does not mean that innovation does not mean
We lost you.
Yes, we did.
some people are using the good notion of direction of growth. My internet is again unstable, but you still hear me?
Yeah.
We lost you for a minute, but you are back.
Okay, thanks. So even we are discussing many themes in the vicinity of growth and employment, innovation will matter. Direction of growth, quality of employment, growth of smaller regions and countries which used to rely more on external demand than bigger countries, external constraints. I'm just only claiming that on the matter there is a subtle boundary between the research agendas through which we ought to walk carefully when we want to combine them. I'm running out of time here, and I won't go deep in some of the questions within the vicinity that we just discussed. You face similar boundaries between research agendas wherever you look at when discussing political economy. For example, one among the most important overlapping themes from different heterodox traditions is about the decision of firms to invest and how does this relate with the economic system as a whole. It would be already important for you to notice that you will find alternative and distinct answers from economists from different sides, from effective demand traditions. I personally liked Kalecki here as a good starting point, and other from Schumpeterian traditions, and a lot of different answers in between. I won't go deeper right now on the matter because I think it would be a bit too much for this presentation. However, I suggest you to already try to pay attention about the boundaries of these themes for the purpose of our goals here. So one final issue before giving the word to Verónica again. I personally think it's important to remember that no one has a definitive answer on how to deal with all these boundaries and challenges that I just talked about. It's quite a challenge to walk through them, and among the best things that we can do, it's to recognize that we also do not have all the answers on the matter. These will perhaps help us listening to others and interact better in such a diverse community as the one engaged in this lecture series. So Verónica will now guide you through some other boundaries and bridges between the economics of technological change and other Keynesian and structuralist issues.
So thank you, João. Okay, I will start regarding Schumpeter. I will provide a reading of Schumpeter works that I will discuss to what extent it is related by evolutionary and innovation system literature. I think it will be particularly useful for young students who have a partial approach to Schumpeter works. First, my connection is unstable. Do you listen to me? Okay. Okay.
Yes.
First, Schumpeter's role in explaining the economic change is unquestionable, especially when he takes into consideration the part of his work that positions him as a kind of prophet of innovation. The other part that positions him as an historian of economic thought, judging by the interest of neo-Schumpeterian colleagues, could seem have been written by a completely different person. I mean, there are almost no reference to his history of economic thought in evolutionary literature, and nor to methodological consideration on science and pseudoscience. And there are good reasons for that, as we will see in a minute. Therefore, here we will see to what extent Schumpeterian ideas are taken by neo-Schumpeterian authors. We will agree that the early attention paid by Schumpeter on innovation, on the role of entrepreneur, and on the diffusion of novelties into the economic systems are the main reasons to position him in the center of the scene to explain economic change. That allows for quantitative change explained by the process of by process innovation and variation of the capacity to produce, and I mean by investments, and qualitative change by creative destruction and the introduction of new products and services. Schumpeter also focused on the uncertainty and the reversibility, as well as on the path dependence of the process of technological change. All of this into a logic that which he links the accumulation of capital with the accumulation of technological capabilities, which is in fact quite close to classical thinking. In short, Schumpeter was an explanation of the sources of endogenous change, quantitative and qualitative, that lead that is led by the research by the search of quasi-rents in the competition process in the famous Peregnian scale of creative destruction. This explanation is present in his two main works, in the history of the economic development, in a naive perspective of the competition process with a very conflicted relationship with the notion of equilibrium, like Dosi has said, since innovation means a break of the equilibrium and the system will be endogenously returned to it through the diffusion process. And in the capitalism, socialism, and democracy, with a more clear position on the dynamics of capital accumulation on the basis of the expansion of technological capabilities and path dependence. Let me pass to the following slides. So, how Phil Mirowski says, and Dosi recently too, Schumpeter was a living and breathing contradiction, and many authors of the contemporary evolutionary theory, without diminishing his merits, make a particular clipping of Schumpeter's works according to their convenience. For example, the primary role given to the entrepreneur as an engine of change and as the only possible origin of new combination is relativized by the innovation system approach, which recognize the nonlinear model of innovation is plagued of interactions, feedbacks between firms, science and technology, institutions, user, producer, financial systems, etc. In the same way, many authors, including Freeman by itself and Nathan Rosenberg, were very critical of the excessive weight given by Schumpeter to radical innovation in change process, minimizing the importance of cumulative learning from small events. In this regard, the adoption of new technology always means adaptation of those technologies, and the accumulation of incremental improvement could be more decisive for the introduction of new products than the original radical innovation. Beyond all these points, there is a bigger contradiction raised by Lausa and quoted by Freeman. Since Schumpeter is trapped in a contradiction that reflects his long life inability to cut with Belarusian umbilical cord, and at the same time his recognition to the crucial importance and complexity of the evolution and change. In this sense, his role as historian of economic thought he seeks to separate ideology from science, and thus argues against Marx because of his ideological character of his works. And at the same time, he elevates Walras, of whom he has great admiration. But Schumpeter's theory on economic change rejects the whole notion of equilibrium, at least in capitalism, socialism, and democracy, and picks up the classical explanation that capital accumulation and technological progress are related in the same vein that classical authors did. So, two final remarks on possible uses of Schumpeter by evolutionary thinking. Schumpeterian and evolutionary authors should not distinguish themselves from the classical literature only by an explanation of the nature and the causes of technological change, but also on how technological change interact with broader questions on economics. And to this last point, structuralist thinking has a few words to say. So, no, sorry, okay. Latin American structuralism is very complex school with a lot of contributors and its own evolutionary path over than 50 years of history. So I will present here its core ideas and the way they can dialogue and the fact they are dialoguing with evolutionary theory and innovation system approach. First, the concept of center periphery. It allows incorporating into the theory the perspective of a global system, and it's very important because it is characterized by the different hierarchies that appears among countries. These hierarchies play little role in innovation system studies, and the recent attempts to integrate them through global value change approach has been problematic, and it has been criticized by authors closer to structuralistic perspective like Casiolato and Shapiro. Second, and very important also, sectors matters. That means that the structural composition of the production structure as well as the international trade profile is a determinant in the possibilities of development. Among different sectors, manufacturers play a key role, especially those sectors intensive in knowledge. Innovation system approach historically has the same concern, although recently it has been problematized by the new opportunities in natural resources and service sectors. Meanwhile, the interest in knowledge-intensive activities remain intact. Third, the question on the process of diffusion of technological change, which is different in the center than in the periphery, because the institutional issues and weak production capacity, but also because of the limited systemic interaction in a disarticulated and incomplete productive structure, which allow a better understand with evolutionary lens. Fourth, cumulative causation and feedback dynamics between productivity and growth in Calder-Burton fashion. This type of dynamics lead to a concentration of development and reinforce the dominant position in the global dynamics and the hierarchies that we have talked about recently. And finally, the centrality of industrial policy in order to overcome low capacity structural problems of periphery. Now, industrial policy is gaining momentum, especially in the COVID context, where states are getting stronger. However, during the 90s, when the innovation studies rises, talking about industrial policy, it was almost a heresy. In a nutshell, specialization is not neutral, not only because of the possibilities of learning, but also because of the disparities among countries and their imbalance of payments and their impact on their balance of payments. In this regard, structural specificities of developing countries marked by structural heterogeneity and specialization in sectors with low with low demand dynamics or low Keynesian efficiency, as put Dosi, will lead to unbalance of payments and Bob constraints that are not easy to overcome. That is part because technology is not diffused in the periphery in the same way that it is in the center, and because it will require active and consistent industrial policy, which should go far beyond solving market failures. So, an interesting point here is that structuralism converges in many aspects with Keynesian literature, but especially on the relevance of effective demand, although it also states the problem of external constraint and therefore the necessity of structural change. Schumpeterian literature provides a microdynamic theory that wells and fit very well with some lacks of structuralist thinking. Among them, why technological progress is not diffused in the periphery like in the center, or how issues and accumulation of technological capabilities affect the possibilities of the structural change in the future. But also structuralism fit and complement evolutionary stories. How does incomplete productive structures with lack of sectors that diffuse technological change affect the well-functioning of innovation system, provoking failures in user-producer interactions? How do state limited capabilities, as well as the presence of power groups, limit the possibility of applying industrial policies for structural change? So, saying that, now I will return the floor to João for the final remarks.
Okay, thank you, Verónica. So evolutionary and innovation systems, another first in discussing change in economics, we saw that, that there are several backgrounds, for example, the classical economists and even the Latin American structuralism. And we try to show a bit more that it is necessary to try to build a critical dialogue between them. So evolutionary and innovation systems perspectives could be integrated with these other strands of economic thought in order to overcome their respective limits. So we should do it carefully with some attention, but it's a good strategy that many economists use. And one thing that derives from this is also that we should not fall on that trap that as students of or researchers of technology systems or innovation systems, that as if we are supposed to defending that technology matters, because obviously it does matter and it's very important, but it's more about to do this better articulation. It's more about to understand where it is relevant and where it is not, where other issues may become central part of a specific issue or not. So trying to make this difference is some important step to make when we're trying to understand the economic system as a whole. So a good strategy that we've shown here is that we may select different schools of economic thought that have different themes at their core. Of course, that different schools of economic thought, sometimes they build a broad analysis of economic system by themselves, but at the same time, they often arise through some core issues on to tackle when discussing political economy. So, for example, Keynes, and not only Keynes, Kalecki, and even Marx if you want, but Keynes and Kalecki are the most famous names here. They are very important to discuss effective demand, growth, and unemployment. And this was the core of the research agenda. And it's important to take some issues that they said in account when we want to discuss growth and unemployment. Latin American structuralism has a very interesting research agenda on the historical and structural specificities of underdeveloped countries, the specific relationship with the world political economic order that these countries, especially from the Latin America, but we might be exploring whether it stands for the whole global South, and I think we should explore that and understand a bit longer. External constraint that Verónica Robert already explained a lot. The power unbalance, how does this is different in underdeveloped countries when compared to developed countries, the states and economic classes. So they lack the micro foundation, as Verónica already discussed that. So we can try to find some critical way. It's not simply combining, but try to do it honestly and critically in order to be reasoned, to be consistent. So the next slide, please. Verónica, the next slide, please. Yeah, thanks. So this is the final slide of our presentation. That just some really final remarks here. But along our presentations, we have talked a lot about technological change and its direction, which is a key aspect for new evolutionary and innovation systems thinking. But at the same time, we should not expect that technological change will per se indirectly solve all of our societal problems. Alternatively, policies for technological change, it's better and they should be guided directly by societal challenge of our countries. This is a very important issue that it's important always to remember. And when we think about the diversity of the challenge of the global South, that it's our primary focus here. So we have always to be questioning ourselves about some specific things on this. What are the current societal, environmental, and economic challenges of the countries in which we are? So we have to do deeper research on the matter, and they are not the same, really not the same of the North countries, of the global North, if you want to. So doing a reason history of these regions and the history of economic thought of different regions, not only from Europe and the United States, may help us to consistently identify some of these answers and move a little further it. So, but you will need to do deeper autonomous and novel research on the specificities of the region in which you are, economic specificities, social problems, and so that is the final message that I would like to drop here at the end of this lecture. So thank you very much to see the class full. It was a pleasure to talk to you all.
Hello, Nanditha. Are you online?
Can you hear me?
Yeah, please.
So I think now Giovanni will give some comments on the talk. So I hand over to Giovanni.
Well, I have many comments. I generally agree with your call for complementarity and convergence. And in fact, I think that there are many issues on which evolutionary theory can represent a bridge for example, between the reflection on technical change, Keynesian issue of effective demand, and the structuralism. Indeed, I think that evolutionary theory is the micro foundation, provides a micro foundation for both structuralist theory and Keynesian theory. I'm well aware that there has been a long time in which if you talk to orthodox, true appellation d'origine contrôlée Keynesian, when you said micro foundation, they would come with allergic reactions, because there is this, and I think it's wrong, this idea that if you talk about micro foundation, then you fall into methodological individualism, utility maximization, etc. I mean, it's obviously not so. I mean, if you describe a beehive, it does not mean that you want each bee to represent each bee as a maximizing agent. I mean, you can have the micro-founded description of a complex system, like you do in physics, like you do in biology, like you should do in economics, without making any assumption on individual rationality. On the contrary, my claim would be that there should be a macroeconomic foundation to micro behavior, in the sense that the micro behavior are informed, shaped by institution, by the way people are socialized, by social conflict, etc. So in the Schumpeter meeting Keynes family of models that we have been elaborating over the last 50 years, this is precisely the attempt. I see a note by Bendoke that says, when I asked Chris Freeman, who was the greatest economist, he said Keynes. I would totally agree with him. Schumpeter would not have given the same answer. I mean, if you read the book review on the American Journal of Statistics by Schumpeter of the general theory, it is like a mediocre essay by a Chicago PhD student. He did not understand about the general theory fuck all, basically, because he did not understand that there is behind the effective demand, there is, or the lack of effective demand, there is a fundamental endemic coordination failure in capitalist economies that is produced, hindered, or helped by the pattern of income distribution. And that is structural. I mean, you have the bastard Keynesian, as John Robinson used to say, that immediately rationalized Keynes as a neoclassical model with frictions. I mean, already with Hicks, 1936, and then the synthesis, the neo-Keynesian synthesis, Modigliani, Klein, Patinkin, etc. It is a system of, Keynes is represented as a system of simultaneous equation in which you have a bar over a variable. For example, typically monetary wages. And having monetary wages fixed, you have all the problem of ISLM, etc., etc. But at the core, there is a friction. This is not my interpretation. This is not our interpretation of Keynes. On the contrary, our interpretation of Keynes is that you have got endemic coordination failures in this decentralized capitalist economy. And this is quite similar to Kalecki. Now, it is easy to bring in innovation in the form of capital embodied innovation and investment, and link it with Keynes. I mean, after all, investment is determined by two things: by an accelerator, that is the past demand that yield to desired new capacity, if any, and autonomous investment that is typically associated with innovation, new method of production, new products, etc. There is no reason to expect that the sum of these two investments is such as to yield a multiplier that corresponds to full employment. And this is, it is possible to show this, for example, with the agent-based models that we have been trying to develop, and they've got an explicit, they have two engines that we call Schumpeterian engine and Keynesian engine. And the Schumpeterian engine is, of course, shorthand for innovation, etc., etc. The Keynesian engine is the generation of effective demand. And the two engines might be matched or not matched, and this determines the level of activity of the system. This is a series of consideration on the links between microeconomics, evolutionary microeconomics, and Keynes. The same, I think, applies to structuralism. I mean, structuralism has a lot of the early structuring, Prebisch, etc., has a lot of macro emphasis, which is important. I mean, the aggregate rate of investment, the balance of payment, the exchange rate, but it is relatively blind on the microeconomics of capabilities accumulation. I mean, after all, if you took very roughly and literally the policy lecture of the early structurers is well, close down, protect your industry, and your industry will come out like a mushroom without any microeconomic intervention. I mean, compare these rough policies with, say, the Korean one, that were messing around with the microeconomic, actually with the structure of the industry, capability accumulation at micro level, nurturing innovative firms, imitative firms, etc. And again, here comes the evolutionary Freemanian urge to understand what is behind the broad system of innovation, but see that one sector is different from another, one technology is different from another. In my language, one technological paradigm is different from the other. if one takes this seriously, I think that so-called neo-Schumpeterian, those that say Giovanni and family, are as a Schumpeterian as I am anorexic, which is not very adequate at the description of me as an anorexic. Essentially, the new Schumpeterian are an attempt to squeeze innovation back to a problem of allocation, and then write down things, silly things in my view, like the production function of ideas. Come on. Production function of ideas. Innovation is a process that you've got to describe within the what happens within the black box. There is no production function of ideas. I mean, in fact, the more I think about it, I mean, I used to think that endogenous growth was an advancement vis-a-vis solo. The more I think about it over the years, and the more I think it's a regress, because it is true that it acknowledges that a good deal of innovation is generated by business firms, but is also a regress in the sense that innovation is reduced to a problem of allocation. So that essentially you invest in a multiplicative, in making grow a multiplicative coefficient that goes before K or L in a production function. In a way, solo is better because solo tells you, I'm ignorant. I know that the majority of progress is due to technical change and scientific advances. I am unable to push it in my production function. My production function tells you how much can be reduced to allocation and interfactor substitution, which is very little. And interestingly, for example, Bob Solo likes very much Nelson Winter. Also for the limitation of Nelson Winter, that in fact, I mean, at macro level, they are very non-Keynesian because they've got market clearing, basically. Also for this reason, Solo likes Nelson Winter, which is the wrong reason. But what else do I? Yes. The one of the limits of evolutionary theory, admittedly, that we have got to deal with is distribution, income distribution. We do not have, in my view, we do not have a satisfactory theory, micro-founded satisfactory theory of the distribution between wages and profits. We are beginning to do that in the recent K process, Schumpeter Keynes models, but we are far from having a full theory. Still, we moved some steps, modeling explicitly modeling in an agent-based way the labor market, but I think we should change a bit our way we model prices, because a flexible markup is the first approximation, but one has got to make it more flexible and dependent on the general condition of the labor market. Last thing, and I'm sure that Luc Soete, that is here, might want to intervene. There is innovation is always seen as good. It's too often seen as good. And Luc precisely suggested that instead of having creative destruction, you might have destructive creation. That is innovation that are bad. And for example, if you take all the fuel-intensive trajectories of innovation, they are associated with a major negative externality that might destroy the world if we go on like that. This is one should reassess our appreciation of the magnificent destiny of innovative activities. I see a comment by Bentoke, Bertil. What about a Kalecki degree of monopoly? Well, it is a conjecture. I mean, the data do not bear very much, neither Kalecki nor on the other side Bain hypothesis that the degree that the margins are associated with concentration. The evidence, the sectoral evidence suggests that the correlation between industrial concentration and profit rates, the correlation is basically zero. So either one comes up with a different theory of monopoly, of degree of monopoly, or maybe Kalecki is more appropriate in information-intensive activities like the Google and the Facebook of this world. Within manufacturing, does not seem to apply very much. Well, I stop here. There are many other things, but I want to leave a space to the discussion.
Thanks a lot, Giovanni. And we also do have some questions from the participants. So I will ask them to Verónica and João.
Nanditha, Professor Luc Soete would like to respond.
Yes.
I'm unmuting him.
I've already given him the.
Yeah, please. That's very good.
No, I think just let me add to the point which Giovanni made, which is not is really the, and I of course would like to link it to the presentations, which is that we have within the innovation community always an assumption that innovation is good for you by definition. And I think this is to some extent is surprising because it assumes that there always are positive externalities related to any process of innovation. And there are a number of studies, but they are within the tradition more or less of endogenous growth theories, Giovanni. So which basically make the line of have analyzed the fact that you could have that firms are interested in destroying the capital value of an existing stock of new products. Think, for instance, of mobiles as the clearest example, and that actually profits are based on destroying as quickly as possible the stock value of a given variety of a product. And then, of course, you can see that innovation becomes the engine of continuous renewal, which leads you straight into negative externalities from, for instance, from an environmental point of view, or from a typically conspicuous consumption. This is the typical argument which Emilio Calvano made, and I think it's still a very nice point. You could also argue that in the financial sector, you similarly have new products being developed which will focus on one specific interaction in the financial area. Think of collateralized debt or other new innovative products, which will basically destroy the basis of lots of financial interactions. And I think, therefore, that we need really to, this is the idea I always had, is that the argument of innovation can have really two sides. It can have the typical Schumpeterian notion of creative destruction, which on average would lead you to a higher level of welfare based on structural change. And I won't enter the discussion now between structuralist and evolutionary thought and the micro foundations of this. This has been well explained by Giovanni. But you could also have the opposite feature, that is that you have a process of destructive creation by which you basically reduce the overall welfare in this case, at the global level, primarily at the environmental level. And I think we as community have studied in a quite insufficient way the negative possible impacts of innovation. And it's surprising because in the technology assessment literature, we always had studies on assessing new technologies, also in broader areas than just in economic terms. We haven't done so at the innovation level.
Yes.
Thank you, Professor Luxoit, for your valuable comments. One of the questions from Professor Rasigan Maharaj is quite related to what we have discussed. The question is it possible to reconcile the utilization of neo-Schumpeterian frameworks within the overall pursuit of neoliberal economic objectives? Do countries of the Global South actually possess the knowledge and confidence to pursue policy sovereignty as opposed to becoming complicit in maintaining the international division of labor and expanding ecocide? That's to Verónica.
First of all, what is a neo-Schumpeterian? If it is a Gion, I have nothing to do with a Gion. So that neo-Schumpeterian, yes, is very much compatible with. In fact, is represent a big support to neoliberal policies, etc. Say evolutionary, that's not called Schumpeterian. Evolutionary theory, on the contrary, can represent a powerful foundation for a set of industrial policies, trade policy, technology policy that have nothing to do with neoliberalism. On the contrary, it's the opposite. If you look at the book edited by Mario Cimoli, myself, and Stiglitz on industrial policy and development, you see that you have got there a lot of ammunition against neoliberal policies.
I think just trying to connect with Giovanni says recently, I think there are in neo-Schumpeterian literature and several authors, several colleagues that are close to neoclassical economics or to mainstream economics, trying to put in mainstream economics a broad stream that have some critical issues to, for example, heterogeneity or especially productive heterogeneity among firms. I guess this is because the new evidence on productivity among firms is quite evident that neoclassical economics cannot stand any longer, that representative agents is a good approximation for reality. And I think that makes the boundaries between some evolutionary economics and new mainstream economics quite blurred or something like that. It's not quite clear which is mainstream economics in some cases and evolutionary economics. And that's what you will see, for example, in policy recommendations of BDI, in the American Development Bank, where the idea of market failures rises once and every moment. So in this regard, I think it's a very good exercise for us, trying to explore those limits between neo-Schumpeterian thinking, evolutionary thinking, and new mainstream economics that are getting closer to a lot of points that we have made in for several years.
Well, I mean, yes and no, in the sense that yes. Let me say this: you have an increasing evidence, for example, on heterogeneity. Heterogeneity is inconsistent with the standard model, say, of the standard microbook, Mascolel, or something like that. But now you have a counter-reformation by, and the counter-reformation is the attempt to incorporate some of the insights that come basically from evolutionary theory and from empirical research, to eat it within the edifice of the neoclassical paradigm. I mean, think of the attempt over the last 10 years or so to reconcile heterogeneity with the production function, in which then you have got some unobserved sunk cost that is nowhere to be seen. I mean, it's like phlogisto in chemistry 3 centuries ago, or the divine providence in Catholic religion. I mean, it's something that you don't see, but is what explains to you the fact that apparently productivities and profits are different. But because you did not take into account the mysterious sum cost, if you introduce that, then you get back to equilibrium. Then I prefer to think of divine providence. I mean, it's more straightforward than, and you have in many fields this attempt to reconcile the evidence with equilibrium and micro-maximization. I think that the fundamental divide between us and them is that in evolutionary theory, there is disequilibrium and behavior that are different from maximization. And these, they will give some concession on rationality, but they cannot give up equilibrium. And this, I think, is the divide. Then, of course, I mean, it's welcome that they start talking about market failures, for example. But again, I mean, is an homeopathic introduction of the huge issue of externalities of that Luke was talking about, trying to squeeze back in, to squeeze the toothpaste back into the container of the toothpaste. I mean, it's very successful. It's very successful. I see it like the Counter-Reformation vis-a-vis the Protestant. I mean, and I'm very worried. Also because people don't realize it. Many people don't realize and think that they are coming our way. No, they're not coming our way. they are trying to eat the terrain in which evolutionary theory was living.
Yeah, one thing on the matter is that sometimes I think that we still spend too much energy in trying to dialogue with the neoclassical economists. I mean, it's too much. It's important to have some understanding of their concepts, of course, to do some critical analysis, but at the end of the day, this was already done. The authors already criticized their fundamentals, their logical assumptions. And at the end of the day, it's important also to abandon these attempts to convince them. It's much more interesting to go trying to bridge the different heterodox traditions. And there are many challenges to do it. And at the end of the day, you really need to provide an alternative answer. So it's not, we should refrain just to keep criticizing. It's one thing is if they try to adjust their framework. I don't think that they will do. I think that they are lost in this trajectory. But one thing that we should not do is to try to convince them, to teach them that much, to let them do their work, we do ours, I think. And the good thing on going to history, to do a reason on history and a history of economic thought, is precisely that it will help us and our students to don't fall in this trap, to do a clear notion of the division between the disciplines that many economists within the vicinity of this tradition still falls. Okay, this is one thing that among the matter that we discussed that I'd like to stress. And another thing is just a comment on policies for innovation and state capacity, because when we do discuss policies for technological change, or it's always relevant to discuss the class structure, the power balances that will actually lead or direct this innovation policy to a direction or another. So, and when we are talking about underdeveloped countries, it's still a big difference regarding the countries broadly saying from the global north, because we don't have state capacity sometimes, but even when we develop them, the political cycles sometimes they change and they get destroyed. This is, for example, what's happening in Brazil at this very moment. So you have to take into account, you can't, we didn't discuss that much today, but you really need to take into account this power imbalances within the states and also the capacity skills to do better policy for innovation. That's something very important.
Next, Professor Benteke wants to comment. I think you're.
Thank you very much. Very nice to see old friends or younger colleagues like Söte and Dosi in good shape. I just would like to add to what Luc was saying on innovation is not always a good thing. We are witnessing two extremely interesting phenomena taking place in US and China. You might have heard about the capital and the role of the social media in closing down for Trump. And you might have heard that in China, the government is considering to nationalize one of the biggest intellectual monopolies over there. And I think this is another, I mean, one thing is to say innovation is not always good, which is definitely true, but here we have systematic cases where the most innovative private units in the world have created fundamental political instability in the United States, and in China, Alibaba and Alibaba Pay is threatening to create financial instability in the world. So obviously, I think for me, I think this kind of concentration, it has to do with Giovanni talked about income distribution as well, because these are enormous machines in redistributing value through monopoly rent. So I think we need to rethink a lot around innovation, not least intellectual property rights. Intellectual property rights have been thought of as guaranteeing the small inventor writing a new song or stuff like that. It's okay. But when it's used to accumulate intellectual capital and to establish these kind of giants which are destabilizing the world, I think this is another topic. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Lundwall. I think we've considered all the questions that I've received. Are there any final comments that anyone wants to make?
Mammo Mucci.
Yeah, Professor Mama would like to. Yeah. Professor, please unmute yourself.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes, yes.
Hello?
Yes.
Hello.
Yes, I'm really happy to listen and also to see all of you, because it's 1 year. I have not even seen my children for 1 year. So it's very, very complicated time. But I just want to challenge all of you. Economics needs to be uneconomics to re-economics it. Innovation needs to be uninnovated to be re-innovated. Creative destruction should be changed to creative construction. We need to take the challenges the world faces now. Demography is one, climate is another one. Now we have health challenges, social inequality challenges. These challenges, how do we create the speed of light, the relativity theory type thing, unified theory, a new logic, a new concept, a new frame to really conceptualize, re-theorize, really, but and really re-economize. So when we say economic gain, if it comes at the expense of other gains, at the loss, when we innovate, some lose, some gain. Is there a way we can create a new win-win, mutually beneficial type roadmap? I'm not trying to be a communist or anything. I'm just simply saying to you, a new approach, a new value, a new thinking to address the challenges the world is now. I think Bal now mentioned a bit about what's going on in America, China, all these other places, and the digital economy, and all this fourth industrial revolution, all these things we are having, machine learning, data. I'm now involved with some very nice young researchers in Rwanda. They have made me an adjunct professor there. And it's called an Africa Center of Excellence in Data Science. I'm just fascinated by the kind of thing they are doing now. And I like us to really rethink this whole stuff. Sincerely, I hope when we get older, I'm now saying, when I get older, my years should be decreased and not, so we should really try to solve the world, not for us, but for the younger generation. What do you think? I mean, I'm just challenging all of you. Thank you very much.
One thing that
Have you heard
we might say, sorry. So just one comment. Thank you, Mamamuchi, for the comments. I think it's really important to find some hope in the middle of this chaotic situation in which we are, and try to don't take out of mind our societal challenges, and really be very directed when we're trying to talk all this stuff, even when we talk about innovation studies. And I do think that we will always need to do novel research, novel theoretical thinking, and also all this stuff. But at the same time, we should not, I hope I don't repeat myself very much here, but in spite of the fact that we do need to do novel research, novel thinking on many issues, we also can't forget that a lot of work on economic thinking, a lot of good work on economic thinking is already done. So in some sense, we don't need to invent the wheel again. There are some things that we should take and we should learn from old theories, from the history of economic thought. So I think it's important to be a bit, to keep this desire that you talked about alive, and at the same time, be humble in relation with the broader history of economic thought that does not encompasses only neoclassical things, and the whole trajectory of different strands of the heterodox economists should be investigated and used for future reasons. They don't have all the answers, of course, but we should also not forget of always try to do it.
Okay, so we are closing up on time. If there are no pressing questions or comments, I can close. So does anyone have a last comment or question?
Just thank you, everyone. Thank you, everybody, for being here. Thank you, guys, for this whole diverse lecture series. Thank you, Giovanni, Dosi, Lundvall, for being here. Thank you, Nanditha, Verónica, Robert, my colleague, and Luke Soth. So it was a real pleasure to be in this very interesting lecture series. So thanks.
Thank you, everyone. And for all your participation, the next series is on the 21st of January on the origins of innovation systems at 2 p.m. Greenwich Mean Time. We hope to see you there. Thank you so much again.
Ciao.
Thank you all. Thank you very much. Ciao.
Thank you. Thank you all. Yeah.
Nice to see you. Look.
Bye-bye.
Thank
Good
you.
to hear
Thanks for
João.
excellent.
Gabir.
All are unmuted.
Now
Please say something.
Yeah. So bye.
Bye.
Got
See
to
you
remember
next
the
week.
group picture at the end as part of the rito. Thank you very much.
Pásala bonito.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, everybody.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Very much.
Good to see many known faces here.
Yeah. Just excellent.
Like virtual global X, doesn't it?
Yeah. Yeah.
How are you?
Fine, really.
Did you like my comment?
Great. It was great.
Please send me the comment.
Yeah, sure,
On
definitely.
the Irish potato.
Yeah.
I'm waiting for you.
I'll send it across. Yeah.
Lovely, yeah. It was very nice. You're doing great.
Thank you so
Keep
much.
it strong.
Yeah.
Say hello to the family.
Sure.
Okay, good. Bye-bye.
Okay, bye-bye.
Yeah. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Forget
Can I
the-
close it now? I'm closing it.
Yeah.
Yeah. See you all. See you all next week. Thank you so much.